that's one. Now, the other one is the mythology of these characters depends on this notion of the great famine, right? The Holodomor. The Holodomor, death by hunger, I guess, is allegedly the deliberate starvation, the deliberate famine and genocide by Stalin and the Soviets against the Ukrainian population in 1932-1933. And I would refer you to the paper by Annie Lacroix, that's Lacroix-RIZ, Annie, A-N-N-I-E, Annie Lacroix, professor of contemporary history, University of Paris 7. And she has a number of papers about this. And this, she says, this is an invention of the European anti-communists. And it goes like this. If you go back, as she has, and look at the correspondence of the various embassies in Moscow, in Warsaw, in similar places, and this includes Germany, Poland, Vatican, you will see that, for example, the French diplomatic reporting says there is a shortage of food, in the disette shortage, and that is 1933 to 1934. It is the fascist embassies, the German and Italian ones, working for Hitler and Mussolini, respectively. They say une famine, a famine. Whatever disette means could be translated as famine, but it's clear famine is much stronger than disette. So the idea then is that it's the German and Italian propaganda, fascist propaganda, that starts up with this famine. Unfortunately, the Vatican seems to have gone along with it, and that was then the point where it becomes overwhelming. Is William Randolph Hearst then comes in, and he starts the agitation about Stalin starving the Ukrainians, and that's where it took off. And this is now the most durable, the most long-lasting myth of what went on in the Soviet Union, and it is the creed of these characters in the Yarosh and Chanibok organizations. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. Now, a couple of more things about Ukraine. It's a complicated topic. Took more time than I'd hoped to budget for it. But we got these insane U.S. elites. At the same time, let's just look at the internal dynamics of this Kiev fascist clique. What are the various appointments with the chaos and collapse that they have? They are now committed with Yatsenyuk to IMF austerity. That will mean removing totally the subsidy on the price of natural gas for cooking and heating. Very bad idea. That will blow the place up, whether it's this winter, which goes on. Remember, I was once in Moscow. It snowed on May 1st. So you figure there's still plenty of winter left out there in Eastern Europe. IMF austerity will mean a social explosion, and that will be directed against this government. So Yatsenyuk says, we are on a kamikaze mission. It's going to be very harsh. It's going to be painful. So that's number one. The second one is in terms of the personalities. When it comes to the presidency, sometime later, not in May, but sometime after that, Klitschko, the Palooka, has come up empty. He didn't get anything in this government. Nobody from the Udar Punch Party has gotten into the cabinet. I wonder if there's a Judy party to go with the Punch Party. But Klitschko was iced out, and Timoshenko took over everything with Turchinov and Yatsenyuk being her stooges. So there's obviously a big problem, because remember, Klitschko has somewhat more traction with the mob than Timoshenko does, right? She's barely tolerated because she's, of course, a kleptocrat who ran the country for 6 or 7 years. And then there's this. Remember that Yarosh and company, as well as Chanibok, that means Right Sector and Svoboda, are raving anti-Semites. And NPR tried to put on a rabbi this week saying, oh, no, there's no such problem. This is ridiculous. You should listen to the appeal coming from the top Chabad Lubavitcher rabbi of Ukraine saying it's very dangerous. That was in Haaretz in Israel. NPR tries to paper this over, but it won't be papered over. Yarosh and Chani Buck, raving anti-Semites. Yatsenyuk is actually Jewish, according to some accounts. So what's that going to be? This also allows us to judge better, I think, when Yatsenyuk came out there at a certain point. He said, if it takes a bullet in the head, I'll take a bullet in the head. And later on, when he appeared, somebody started yelling bullet in the head at him. Those might simply be people who are against him, not because he's an IMF agent, but because he's Jewish. So this is a terrible situation. Now, given all that, we have this insane U.S. elite. What could be the salvation of the world? It turns out, and this is important for people to understand, the interests of the future of civilization coincide and will coincide for a significant time with Putin's program of restoring Russian dignity and, to some extent, Russian power, certainly. The Russian view of this, of what's happening in Crimea, is under the heading of the ingathering of the Russian lands. In other words, that last pulsation in 1991-92 pulsated too far. The pendulum swung too far in the anti-Russian direction, and I think that's probably legitimate. And certainly, from the point of view of the United States and Europe, it is important that Russia be strong. Unfortunately, this situation of U.S. world supremacy from 1991 on until now, this has brought out the worst in the United States. It has created these horrendous figures that we see, the Kerrys, the Susan Rices, the Samantha Powers, the Newlands, and so on down the line, right? These imperialist monsters, radical subjectivists, raving ideologues, right? Collective insanity in the elite. The only remedy of this is a power center in the world which is sufficiently strong and self-confident and has the will and the intention to counterbalance the United States to some significant degree in world affairs. We don't need World War III, certainly, but we need to get back to a situation of at least rough equivalence, rough balance, and I mean approximate balance. Nothing rough needs to go on. Otherwise, I don't see how you contain the insanity of the U.S. elite. I don't see what force on earth could counterbalance this. And the dangers are obviously quite real. So remember, when the Soviet Union was strong, real wages in the United States were much higher. And this was because the U.S. elite, evil bankers though they were, finance oligarchs, predators, and what have you, they had some sense that there was a point beyond which they could not go in looting and degrading the U.S. population, because they realized that there would come a point where people would say, look, I'm so fed up with Wall Street domination, let's see what these other guys have to offer. That point can be reached in any country. And today it could be reached even more easily than in the past. The question for Russia, what is missing from the Russian approach, I would say, is an attractive economic model. Putin has said to the oligarchs, look, you guys keep out of politics and I'll tolerate your existence, right? If you cross the line like Khodorkovsky, to jail you go. If you try to organize a coup, you're going to be jailed. But otherwise, oligarchs can go on, right? And that would include also other oligarchs, right? The ones that fled to London, but then continued their subversion. What would be necessary is a dirigist, protectionist, mercantilist model with a strong state sector and a strong role for state initiatives in Russia. And that, I'm afraid, has not come sufficiently to the fore. We had Kudrin as finance minister for quite a while, until a couple of years ago. He was the last prominent figure of the Yeltsin era who held on. And that's exactly the opposite of what it should have been. It should have been the economic transformation very early on. But in any case, you've got to wish Russia well in all of these regards because of the need to counterbalance and contain the insane U.S. elite who otherwise will proceed to run wild over the world and willy-nilly cause World War III. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. A good word that might be applied to the right sector and Svoboda parties in Kiev is revanchism. Revanchism was the Soviet propaganda term for Bonn, right? For West Germany, for Adenauer and his successors in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s. And in those days, it meant German forces who wanted revenge, la revanche, for their defeat in World War II, and they were therefore revanchists, looking for revenge against the Soviets who had humiliated them. I think today it is revanchism on the part of Chanibok and Yarosh and the rest of these creatures. And let's never forget our friend Muzichko, the goon who fought alongside the Chechen terrorists and who tells you how many tanks and APCs he destroyed. These revanchists obviously cannot be supported, but the entire U.S. foreign policy is built either on the killers, the death squads of Syria, or the revanchists, the neo-fascists of the Ukrainian regime.